Hi, and welcome to my channel. I thought I'd do something a little different and try a vlog. And there's a reason why I've done that, and I'll explain it in a moment. For right now, the weather has finally changed where I live, and it actually feels like fall. So in preparation for the month of October, a few months ago I started on a list of my favorite horror games so that I could present them in the month of October. One problem: I have way too many of my favorite games. So that's why I'm doing a vlog, because if I gave you every piece of footage and explained everything about the games that I liked, this would be hours upon hours long. Later on I'll go into depth about the games, so right now I'm just going to show you what I've got and give you my ranking. Please enjoy my top 17 horror games on the console through October of 2014, with honorable mentions, by the way. At number 17 on my list is one of my favorite nostalgic survival horror games. That game is Silent Hill on the PlayStation. Silent Hill was released on the PlayStation in January of 1999 and was published by Konami. Silent Hill was one of those games where it got into your head, and I had a hard time dealing with the game. I was a teenager when this game came out, and the imagery in the game often reminded me of something that Tool could have done. Twisted basements, hospitals, and schools were what this game had to offer. A sense of atmosphere that was second to none. There are also several different endings in Silent Hill, depending on how you completed the game. Once again, the game did terrify me, and I had a very hard time sleeping after I turned the game off. Number 16. Resistance: Fall of Man. Resistance: Fall of Man was released in 2006 on the PS3 and was developed by Insomniac Games. This game I was not expecting to be a horror game until I booted it up. Resistance is set back in 1951, and there is an alien-like invasion that has happened on planet Earth. And the aliens are horrific, and the first-person perspective of the game, combined with the horror element from the aliens, gives an all-encompassing horror-like atmosphere that you can't deny. The shooting is well thought out, and I thought the game did very well at conveying what it might be like if we had an alien invasion, and it's quite terrifying. Resistance: Fall of Man has a perfect art style for this era of game it is trying to portray, and I highly recommend it if you're into horror games and a first-person shooter. It also helps to have a PS3. Next up at number 15 is Silent Hill 3. This version on the PS2, and I have the HD version on the PS3. Now granted, this one's a little buggy and they tried to fix it, but it seems to be the PS2 version or the Xbox version is the better choice. So I'll hold this one up. Silent Hill 3 was released by Konami in May of 2003 and was a direct successor to the first game, not the second one. This game focuses more on the girl Heather that Harry from the first game is now raising, and it's set 17 years, like I said, after the first Silent Hill game. Silent Hill 3 continues the tradition of the survival horror genre, with puzzles and an environment that definitely invites thinking about the game long after you shut it off. Once again, survival horror fans, Silent Hill 3 is a must for your collection. Next up at number 14 is a game that was my very first exposure to not only survival horror, but the horror genre in general on a video game system. And this game is actually one of two games that brought me back into playing video games. At number 14, that game is Resident Evil on the PS1. And here's the director's cut as well. But we'll hold this one up because it has the original art on it. Resident Evil was released by Capcom in 1996. So I didn't discover this game until 1997, almost 1998, when a friend of mine dropped this game off and the PlayStation at my apartment for my roommate and I to play. Now, if I was going on pure nostalgia, this game would be rated number 1. I still play it several times, and what made this game interesting was the quote-unquote tank controls or cinematic camera that was going on in the game. A lot of people have a hard time with tank controls, but it actually came second nature to me, and the only reason is I raced RC cars. So no matter what, left is always left of the character, not left on the screen or right on the screen. So I didn't have that hard of a time adjusting to it. And it built tension. It had these up and down moments that just made the game intense, and then you made it through a part and you could relax again. And I'm sorry, I still like save stations. There's nothing better than getting that relief that you've saved the game and you don't have to do that part over again. Doesn't work for all games, but in horror games, it's pretty good. To get back to my roommate and I playing the game, we stayed up all night. A, because the game was so good, and then B, because we were terrified to go to sleep. This game got in your head. You felt like things were coming down the hallway, and my favorite moment from this game is when the hunter is coming after you and you can see through his eyes, and all you want to do is to get back to your character and start to run. But it won't let you, not till it's done with the FMV sequence. Resident Evil, the original, is still one of my favorites, and if you can stomach the tank controls and the shoddy graphics of the PS1, you're in for a fantastic game. Like I said, I still play it today. Up next at number 13 is Silent Hill 2. Released by Konami in September of 2001, Silent Hill 2 was not an actual continuation of the story from the first Silent Hill. What it did was it took on a whole new cast of characters. I originally had this game on the PS2, and I have about a dozen of my horror titles from that era that I no longer have. And it's because I didn't have a whole lot of money, and I still wanted to play the games that were out, that were new. So I traded those in. Later on, I collected and tried to get those back, so I picked up the Xbox version because it was cheap. Silent Hill 2 has James as your character that you play, and James has some problems, and he manages somehow to get to the town of Silent Hill, and just like Harry in the first game, he has all kinds of problems in Silent Hill, especially when that horn goes off. The whole town changes, everything changes, and leaves you and James wondering what the hell is going on. This also has the infamous Pyramid Head. Silent Hill 2 is still my favorite Silent Hill in the whole series, even though the very first Silent Hill holds a very high nostalgic factor for me. Silent Hill 2 is admittedly a better game, technically, graphically, and the story I thought was better than the first Silent Hill. Once again, this cannot be passed up. If you love horror games, if you love survival horror games, this is a must. It takes just a little bit to get going, but once it does, you won't be disappointed because the story is by far one of the best ones we have, even to this day. At number 12, we have Dead Space. This one's on the PS3. Once again, I had this one on the Xbox 360 to begin with, and then I had to trade it in because I had no money at the time and I wanted something else. So then I went back out and got this one because I found myself wanting to replay certain parts of the game. Dead Space was released by EA in October of 2008 and has a very sci-fi horror theme with it. In recent memory, it's the game that kind of reignited the survival horror aspect of gaming with the over-the-shoulder, third-person kind of perspective that we were used to from games like Resident Evil 4 years before it. Now, I have to say, I did not play Dead Space when it first came out. I was a bit skeptical because by that time, horror games were not really that popular. They seemed to have died off, and I really missed the original survival horror aspect of games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. But after hearing its many praises, I picked up Dead Space, and it does not disappoint. Dead Space has a creepy vibe that just doesn't give up throughout the whole game, and the way you have to take the monsters down is by taking off their limbs, not shooting them in the head. The necromorphs never stop coming until you do that. So it was a very interesting game mechanic that they implemented in the game. Dead Space is an excellent game to play. Next up at number 11 is a game I'm going to get a lot of flack for, but just hear me out for a minute. It's Resident Evil 5. Now, why did I go and pick Resident Evil 5? If you get rid of that whole Resident Evil part, the game actually isn't a bad action horror game. It vastly strayed from its Resident Evil roots, which I think Resident Evil 4 kind of planted at the end of its game. Resident Evil 5 took what Resident Evil 4 left with and ran with that concept. Resident Evil 5 was released in March of 2009 and once again still produced by Capcom, and was met with some mixed results. Ultimately, most people praised it for being a competent third-person shooter, but really down on the horror value, and I do not disagree with that. The thing that really weighed it down was because it had the Resident Evil name on top of it. If you got rid of the Resident Evil game, once again, I believe that this game is actually a very solid and very well done third-person shooter. It was very hard for me to pick between this one, well actually rank this one, and Dead Space. But ultimately, the co-op is actually what made this game fun. Yes, it did not give you the horror vibe that you were looking for, but I originally bought this game on the Xbox 360 and played through it twice with a buddy of mine. It was an excellent game to play co-op with, provided hours of entertainment, and then I got rid of it because, well, I didn't think I wanted to play it anymore. But then I decided I wanted to try the single player, so I went and got the PS3 Gold Edition because they had it on sale. Yay! In single player mode, it's a little more difficult. Your AI character is not super smart, and having to try to get your AI comrade to listen to your commands is sometimes a little frustrating. But the action's over the top, it still plays well, and I still recommend it if you can get past that Resident Evil title on there. Alright, we're into our top 10 now, and at number 10 sits Resident Evil 3. There's the PlayStation 1. I also have the Dreamcast one. I haven't played the Dreamcast one yet. But Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation is one of the very first games I actually pre-ordered. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released in 1999 and still was developed by Capcom, like it's ever going to change, and it introduced the Nemesis system. The Nemesis could stalk you throughout the whole game, and that's what made it terrifying. If it had not been for the Nemesis system, I believe this game would have become very stale because it actually doesn't do a whole lot different from the first two. Story's not super great, but it was Resident Evil, and at the time I was willing to take any Resident Evil I could get my hands on. And it's still a great game to play. Resident Evil collectors, survival horror collectors, Resident Evil 3 is a must-have, and like I said, Nemesis, scary as hell. Sitting at number 9 is Dead Space 2 on the PS3. Dead Space 2 was developed by Visceral Games and released in 2011, and refined what the first Dead Space did in the survival horror genre. A little bit better graphics, a little bit better mechanics. Story was still on par. You know, it wasn't super amazing, but it still was good enough to keep you compelled to finish it to the end. One of the most terrifying scenes out of any horror game, though, is the opening scene when you're in the asylum and the guy's trying to release you, and his head splits open and becomes a necromorph. It's terrifying. I actually stopped the game after that point. It freaked me out so bad. So that's why I ended up ranking it a little higher than the original Dead Space. It just felt a little better, and I don't think it was any more scary than the first Dead Space, but it definitely had an in-your-face presence about, here's the horror aspect of this game, and we're going to give you some more firepower to play with them. The necromorphs are still terrifying, the environments are still creepy, and we're not going to talk about Dead Space 3. But Dead Space 2 is really good.